Good afternoon.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Stand by one moment.
Hello, I'm Harry Robinson, and this is the All Out Attack podcast.
Right, let's get this sorted out.
Oh, I'm loving the backdrop. You're much more professional than me.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Right, nice to see you, Harry.
My guest today is Peter Bleksley, one of the founding members of Scotland Yard's Undercover unit in the 80s, and someone who is probably most famous for catching fake fugitives on Channel 4's hit reality show, Hunted.
Hello, Chief, how you doing?
All right, thank you. More importantly, how are you doing?
Also, I wanted to ask, how was your fundraising over the past month?
Yes, it was a challenge, but I did it. And I'm delighted to say I raised over £12,000, so that was wonderful.
Wow. No, that's spectacular. Pete spent 21 years as a detective, taking on different identities on a daily basis and building a reputation for being one of the best undercover narcotics detectives in Europe. After being forced to retire from the police, and after a lengthy stint writing books and appearing on TV, Peter is now hunting a real fugitive in Kevin Parle, a man wanted in connection to two murders who's been on the run for over 16 years.
Marvellous, thank you very much. And yeah, feel free to discuss Kevin Parle as much as you want.
After chatting about football,
I'll always go to Rangers.
Yeah.
My mates, for the love of the club, and because it's what I do. And if I don't go to football, my wife will drag me to Blue Wall.
And chewing the fat, I got to see firsthand the overwhelming determination and dedication that Peter has for catching Kevin Parle. He's been to hell and back, but now he's trying to bring about justice for the families still wading through those dark days. I hope you enjoy. I'll just jump right into it then. I mean, obviously, you're a man who's had many identities, wore many hats, quite literally many identities. I'll let you introduce yourself. Who is Peter Bleksley?
Hi. Well, as you can see, I'm a bit of an old bloke. I'm 61, but I'm very enthusiastic. I love work. I love life, really. I'm determined to rinse it for every ounce of enjoyment that I possibly can while I'm here. And that's been my ethos throughout my life, generally speaking. That's not to say there hasn't been very dark times, of course, but into every life, a little rain must fall. As a kid, 17 years old, I joined the police cadets, largely inspired by my mum, who got a neighbourhood cop to come round and give me a bit of a talking to and persuade me that some of the antics I was getting up to wasn't perhaps the smartest idea and that I ought to think about joining the police cadets, which I did, thanks to that cop. And so I did 18 months as a cadet. Then I joined the police as a PC. And in 1978, I got posted to the very mean streets of Peckham in southeast London. And if I thought I'd been a bit of a Jack the Lad in leafy Bexley Heath, well, I was a complete marshmallow compared to many of the people that I encountered in Peckham. And I grew up pretty quick. Stayed at Peckham until 1982, when I was fortunate enough to be selected as a detective. And then I went to the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, a very different manner from Peckham,
100%.
Different crime, different people, different challenges. Loved it there, being a detective. And then in 1985, achieved my ambition of becoming a Scotland Yard detective. So at the age of 25, pulled my shoulders back, puffed my chest out, and with no little pride, walked through the revolving doors of Scotland Yard for the first time. And then I entered a completely different world.
Well, what was it that drove you into, I mean, you talk about it being a completely different world, going from normal policing and in Peckham and Kensington to going into the kind of world of plainclothes detectives and undercover work. What was it that drove you away from the police work?
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed my time at Peckham for good reasons and bad. When I became a detective and went to Kensington, again, that was very different work. I enjoyed wearing a suit or a pair of jeans instead of wearing a uniform. But the next kind of natural progression was to become a Scotland Yard detective. in those days, and largely still today, officers tend to pursue either promotion or specialisation. Some officers manage to straddle both, but I chose specialisation. I wanted to have that on my CV that I was a Scotland Yard detective. That was where the resources were. That was where the expertise tended to live. And when I got up there to what was then called the Central Drug Squad, so we're talking about the 1980s, Ronald Reagan is the president of the US, and he's banging on about the war on drugs, and his wife is running what was manifestly the most unsuccessful campaign in the history of mankind, which was the Just Say No campaign. Well, of course,
it was that easy.
The whole world listened to her, didn't they? And nobody's ever taken any drugs since. And I thought that was the area of crime that was going to have the money thrown at it, that was going to be very much in the spotlight because of this whole nonsense war on drugs campaign that was being fought. It was very, very much at the forefront of the media's thinking. The cocaine explosion onto the streets of the UK was happening. The ecstasy and the rave scene was just around the corner. And I chose that squad instead of the flying squad, which some people have persuaded me to join. Now, the flying squad deal with armed robberies, cash in transit, over the pavement jobs, as they would call it, when a gang of armed robbers would leap out of a couple of stolen cars and attack security guards. Well, by the time the mid-80s came around, I knew, because I kept my ear very close to the ground, that the proper criminals were moving away from that. It was too high risk. There was a distinct likelihood that you might get shot dead by the police, because a number of armed robbers had been.
Yeah.
And they were turning away from it because they were beginning to familiarise themselves with this whole drugs dealing malarkey. Armed robbers from the 70s hadn't gone anywhere near drugs, but now in the mid-80s, they're thinking, well, what is the point of running the risk of getting shot, running the risk of getting a 25, 30-year jail term for robbing a bank? Let's go and deal drugs. It's less risky. The profits are greater. And at that time, they were absolutely right. And so I could see around the corner. I knew what was coming, and I wanted to go where the spotlight would be, albeit not that I was going to be in the media and in the spotlight, but in policing terms, where the spotlight would be.
Well, I mean, if you look at the world now as well, bank robbing and armed robbery isn't the thing that has skyrocketed in the last few decades. It's, drugs everywhere. I could probably walk 20 yards down the road and get myself some drugs. Do you know what I mean? I can't walk 20 yards up the road and get a bank heist together. So
no, but mainly because there's hardly any banks left on the ice. Let alone anything else. But there's a saying that you may or may not be familiar with, and that's that you're never more than 6 foot away from a rat, apparently, in London anyway, because they live in the sewers and they're not far beneath our feet, or riverbanks and the like. Well, I would say you're never more than 6 minutes away from a drug dealer, wherever you are in the UK. And the whole nonsense of this war on drugs is exactly that. It's a nonsense. It's a war that cannot and will not ever be won. And I say that through the benefit of being involved in drugs for so much of my life. For a decade, I worked undercover, pretending to be a drug dealer, and many other roles as well. I foolishly got overly familiar with drugs when I left the police, to my detriment. Although I'm not a Puritan about it, I certainly, would never advocate just say no, because that's a nonsense. To change people's state of mind is all a part of being a human being. Every human being changes their mind, whether that be by smoking a joint, tooting a line, dropping a pill, having a cigarette, having a swig of coffee to get some caffeine to change your state of mind, going to the cinema to watch a movie to transport yourself to a different place, watching the telly, reading a book, listening to a podcast. We all want to change our mind.
It's escapism, isn't it?
It might be whatever you want to choose to call it, but it's being a part of a human being is changing your state of mind. People just choose to do it through different things. And so taking drugs is as old as mankind itself. And this prohibitionist nonsense that we find ourselves in is just foolish and wrong and causes more harm than good. I mean, we could be here for hours talking about it.
Well, I know you yourself are a bit of a drug reformist, and I mean, you know, normally I'd keep my opinions out of it, but I tend to kind of agree with that, especially with, I mean, the criminalization of spice is a huge example in the fact that spice has now become more deadly and now, you know, is taking apart prisons and you know, rampant throughout communities. And beforehand, not that it was any good for the human body or anything, but you know, there was a shop near ours that would sell spice, although I was kind of unknown to it, being too young. But now, it was this legal high that is largely, you know, non-deadly and a bit smackish and whatever. And then, you know, you go into a prison and your people are dropping dead. And it all comes from this kind of prohibitionist ideology that you're talking about, in terms of that things aren't pure and things get into the wrong hands and people are taking the wrong kind of stuff if you criminalize it and make it such a bad thing, surely.
Yeah, if everybody who takes an illegal drug, and there are millions of people in the UK that do that, the overwhelming majority of them are not problematic drug users, by the way. Sadly, there is a minority of people whose lives implode and get destroyed, and sadly sometimes ended by drugs. But you can say the same for alcohol, cigarettes, both of which I enjoy. Please don't ever smoke, kids. It's a nonsense, smelly, expensive, antisocial, ridiculous way to shorten your life and empty your bank account. But, you know, I enjoy those kind of things. And the more governments throughout the centuries have tried to drive things underground, then the greater the demand has been for them. And the illegal drugs industry is purely and simply like any other business. It's about supply and demand. And the demand just will not go away because people want to change their state of being. And the demand is huge. And 50 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act, which we've now had because it was enacted in 1971, hasn't altered anything. It's just made things worse. We've filled our prisons to breaking point, and of course that hasn't worked. Lengthy jail sentences have not been a deterrent for people drug dealing. There are more people drug dealing now than ever, more people taking drugs now than ever, and still you get stupid, nothing, idiotic politicians banging on about being tough on drugs and the war on drugs and all of that, and it's nonsense.
And the likelihood is that the level of cocaine use in the Houses of Parliament, you know, is probably pretty high. It's popcorn and kettle black and that kind of stuff.
People take drugs. I mean, please, let's not get dragged into a discussion about the hypocrisy of politicians, because otherwise we'll never get a touch on anything else. You know, it's a nonsense situation that we find ourselves in, and the way to take away the teenage rebelliousness out of drugs, and let's face it, so many young people get into drugs because it's an act of teenage rebellion. It's illegal, let's try and do it. That's the default position for so many millions of teenagers. If, for example, my vision of a world post-drug law reform was that there was what I shall unimaginatively call a drugstore on every high street, right? So chemists, pharmacies, whatever people want to call it, which is where you would go to get your pill, your line, your joint, whatever it was that floats your boat. If as a teenager you were queuing up there on a Saturday to buy your tablet, to buy your gram of Charlie, to buy your joints, and standing in the same queue was your granddad who wanted to buy himself a nice big bifter to have a bang on while he's watching Strictly, right? All of a sudden, it ain't quite so cool to be a teenager, is it? and be in the same queue, you know, potentially buying the same drug.
Yeah.
So that whole rebelliousness just goes out the window. Take smoking, for example. You know, so many kids around here have been educated away from smoking when they were tiny little children in primary school.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been done very successfully. If drugs weren't this taboo, you can't talk about it kind of subject, or when parents who don't know anything about about drugs, or teachers that don't know anything about drugs, try and educate children about it, they just say, don't do them, they're all dangerous and you're all going to die, which of course is complete bollocks. And so those kind of scare 'em, hair 'em kind of lines just don't work with,
It's never
young
worked.
people.
Yeah.
You've got to tell them the truth. And the truth is, yes, if you become an addicted, problematic drug user, and heroin and crack are your drugs of originally choice, but then necessity, yeah, okay, you quite probably will shorten your life. But if what you want to do is have a joint so that you can eat 4 boxes of Maltesers and understand modern jazz, well, that's probably not going to kill you. You might put on a pound or 2. Likewise, if you go to a rave, a concert, a festival, and you drop a couple of E's, yes, there's a risk that you will take one from a contaminated batch and you'll die. Yes, there's a risk that you'll get dehydrated and need hospitalization, and those kind of associated risks. But in all likelihood, the overwhelming majority of those people who guzzle a pill at a festival are going to be fine.
Mm-hmm. And they do it anyway.
Yeah, and they'll do it anyway. Yeah, of course. You know, and the first aid tent, yes, we'll have people in there that are not very well on it, but 10,000 people won't die. You know, so we need to tell the truth. We've got lunatic politicians who are rampant hypocrites, as you alluded to. They've taken drugs, if not continue to take drugs, and yet they want to preach on high about locking people up and being tough on it and all that kind of stuff. And it's just been proven in this country for 50 years at least, and around the world, it simply doesn't work. What you need is regulation of the industry, legalization and regulation of the industry, not piecemeal, not bit by bit, but across the board. Because whosoever is buying drugs tonight, wheresoever they are in the country, will buy them from criminals.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, this is a major industry that is left entirely in the hands of criminals.
Mm-hmm.
Would you let criminals run the railways? Yeah, I know there's a joke there, yeah, about how they currently do and all that kind of stuff, right? But I'm being serious here. Would you let criminals run the NHS? Ditto, same gag, I know, right? But you wouldn't. And yet we let unscrupulous criminals whose only interest is to get you buying more and more of their product.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we let criminals run this industry? It's absolute lunacy.
Well,
it needs to be legalized and regulated.
I mean, this is coming from a man as well who, you know, obviously not your personal money, but you've bought millions and millions of pounds worth of drugs in your detective career and your undercover career. It shows the amount of money that's coming into that industry. And you look at the marijuana industry in like California, say, it's stupid amounts of money from something that hasn't killed anyone over there, hasn't, you know, ruined anyone's life over there. You know, it's well, but coming on to that actually, because it's something I want to ask. Obviously, you have spent time going undercover and buying drugs, and you know you have your way of weighing up drugs. You have to know your stuff, so you come across as a successful, you know, criminal. You to play the ruse. Do you kind of remember your early undercover cases where you really started to build up those skills? Of understanding the drug world and blending in?
Yeah, the easiest lie to tell is one that's close to the truth. Now, so when I went undercover, the character that I portrayed was always close to who I actually am. And I could only ever portray being an oik from South London. I couldn't suddenly claim to be an expert in fine art because I was privately educated, at a fee-paying school. I couldn't have carried that off. So I stuck close to what I was. I used to, when we weren't actually discussing business with the criminals, I used to stick to talking about the 3 Fs. And if you're part of my language, that was fighting, fucking, and football, because I had some experience of all those. So, stick to the lie that's closest to the truth. And being from South London, having been in the cops for 7 years by the time I got to Scotland Yard, and also socialising with my mates, not police officers, at the weekends and stuff, it's fair to say that I was pretty familiar with drugs. I knew my way around a line of Charlie and a joint and a pill and all of that through policing and being around my friends.
Were you a drug user yourself, or was it just your friends kind of in that circle?
Oh, I'd be telling you a lie if I said I'd never smoked a joint when I was in the cops, or I'd never got wrapped around a line of Charlie, but not a lot, unfortunately. And to my kind of shame and stupidity, I got overly familiar with drugs after I'd left the police, because I got medically retired when I was 40. And I suppose when I went out partying, I was trying to replicate the buzz that working undercover had given me that was unfortunately taken away from me. So yeah, I got a bit too familiar with gear then, but as soon as my wife got wind of it, she grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, metaphorically speaking, and marched me to the edge of the precipice and said, either you get your shit together or you'll be losing your home, your wife and your children. So that was a pretty clear decision that I had to make. And I haven't touched a drug in, 17, 18 years, something like that. And coincidentally, they've been the best 18 years of my life. And well, it is no coincidence as it happens. That's one is directly attributable to the other. So yeah, I've been around drugs all my life, working undercover and buying tens of millions of pounds worth of it, taking it, pretending to be a dealer, all that sort of stuff. And my advice would be this, because I'm not a Puritan and I'm not going to ever say to anybody, don't take drugs. That's your choice. You will, of course, be funding criminals because you'll only be able to buy it from criminals at the moment. So I'd ask you to think about that. But if you do take a bit of gear, this would be my advice. When you're in company, and I hope that you're taking drugs in company and not alone. Once again, I'm not condoning it, but if you're taking gear and you're on your own, then I think you're really on a very slippery slope. But if you're in company and you're having a joint or you're having a line or this, that, and the other, get your phone out, right? Get your mobile phone out. And when you are all sitting there thinking that you are the most interesting person in the room, the brightest person in the room, the one that understands modern jazz and all that kind of stuff, just hit voice notes and record yourself, right? And listen to you and your pal the following morning or the day after, depending on how much of a bender you've been on. But whenever you've got your head half straight, right, and you're sober and you're clear of thought, go back into your phone and replay that voice note that you recorded. And I hope you've let it run for an hour or two. Okay? And then listen to it. And listen to the complete and utter bollocks that you've been talking. Listen to what an interminable bore you actually are. And then ask yourself a question about how interesting you are and all that kind of stuff when you're on a bit of gear. I'd just ask you to do that and draw your own conclusions about how you think you might have lit the room up. I would say chances are you have probably, in the cold light of day, you will think, I sound like such a twat. And you might just reassess.
Would you ever have to in order to remain undercover? Would you ever have to kind of do drugs or that kind of stuff to blend in?
Yeah. Often it would be a deal breaker. Sometimes it would be a deal breaker because the drug dealers would have it in their heads that, well, if this bloke doesn't take drugs, then he must be an undercover cop because undercover cops don't take drugs, right? Well, I debunked that myth. But when you are negotiating with some very tasty people, and these business negotiations are for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds worth of drugs, you don't want to be off your nut. You really, really do not want to have your thinking impaired by alcohol or drugs. You want to be crystal clear. Mm-hmm. So I would steer away from it at every single possible opportunity. But there's only so many times you could say to someone, oh, I've got a heart condition, so I don't take it. I mean, I never used that line, but I knew some cops that did, right? Yeah. You know, or actually I've got the car parked around the corner and I hate driving when I'm stoned because I get really paranoid and all that kind of stuff. You know, those kind of excuses can only be used for so long. Mm-hmm. What I would tend to do, because I was proficient at it, say, for example, it was going to be a deal breaker. If I didn't have a bang on this joint, the negotiations weren't going to go any further. So what I would do is I would say to the geezer who's producing the bit of puff and the skins, I'd go on, give me the papers. And I'd grab the papers off him. And I would put together a 3 skin, a 5 skin, a 7 skin. I could build a joint like my arm. Yeah. Right? Okay. And then what I would do is if I'm building the joint, mm-hmm. I will backload it. So I won't put any dope towards the front of the joint. So I'll give it like a centimetre with no dope in it, just tobacco towards the front. And I'll backload the joint. So then when I've built it, I go, right, I've built it. I'm going to spark it. Get the lighter, boom, spark it up, have a couple of bangs on that, make it look like I'm inhaling, you know, all the dope and I'm having a, you know, seeing what it's doing to me and all that kind of game, boom, and then pass it on. But the fact of the matter is, because I've backloaded it, there's been no dope towards the front, and any residual burning of gear that might have happened between the front of the joint and the roach, which has gone in my gob, is pretty negligible. Yeah. So then I just slowly watch them all get stoned because I know it's backloaded and I've had a bang on it and I'm like fine.
Is it easier? Is it easier to blend in when everyone else is stoned around you?
No, well, you know, I didn't sit in crack houses full of mangled people. I was a businessman, right? You know, and these were business deals. But sometimes some of the people that I was negotiating with used to break the rule. And the rule is never get high on what you supply. But some people broke that. You know, some of the people that I dealt with were able to deal in multi-kilos, even though they were problematic drug users who were psychotic and very, very dangerous. Mm-hmm. But you would have to adopt your tactics and the language that you used and the way you spoke to people and your body language according to what company you were in and what firm you were dealing with. It always varied. The rules were never the same. You could never plant your goalposts in the same position between one job and another. You had to be flexible and think on your feet. Likewise, if we were buying cocaine and somebody would pull out, you know, an 8-ball, for example, and say, right, come on, this is the gear we're going to buy. You know, I want you to have a bang on it now to see what it's like. Well, I got very adept at pulling out a credit card, or in those days, even a phone card. That's history lesson for you kids. There used to be car phones, public phones that you put a card into, right? And I would get the gear and I'd rack it up, I'd chop it up. And I was very, very adept. I'd say, and what's your name? And he'd go, Paul. And I would rack up a big P, a big letter P, right? I could put Benz in my lines, you know what I mean? I was that proficient at it. And then I'd hand it to him and say, there you go. And they'd laugh because suddenly they've got their initial to snort. So instead of having a straight line, they're going up and around. And they all thought that was good fun. And of course, it showed huge familiarity with gear.
Yes.
You know, for me. You go, and what's your name? Steve. All right, a bit more change. I've got to do a curvy S. So I've got to chop all the gear into a curvy S. You go, there you go, Steve, there's a nice big S for you. And they like all that. And those were just the little touches that made people less paranoid, thinking about, well, I've only known this bloke for a day, a week, a month. Is he connected to the old bill, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it was always about bringing the paranoia down, showing how familiar you were with gear. And I knew gear inside out, is why I was the country's leading authority, if not the continent's leading authority, as an undercover cop on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
I could wash up your cocaine and make crack out of it and all that kind of stuff with my eyes shut.
Yeah.
Because like any line of business you go into, if you're in business, you've got to know your business, or else you're gonna be caught short.
God, yeah. You were talking about being flexible, and obviously you're also saying beforehand about having to kind of be this oiky cockney, and it's easier to stay closer to your truth. Was there ever any undercover jobs where you had to really take on quite a strange role, or that kind of side, or was it always the
stick to what you know. Yeah. Stick to what you know. Go back to what I said earlier. The easiest lie to tell is the one that's closest to the truth. So I would never pretend to be anything that I really was. That was too much of a stretch.
Yeah.
You got to be yourself. You got to remember that sometimes I'm dealing with psychotic people who've got a 9mm shoved down the back of their trousers. So
who's the most psychotic? Who's the most psychotic you've had to deal with then? Whilst
put it this way, there was a lot of people that were extremely dangerous, and if people want to read all about it, then my autobiography, The Gangbuster, is still out there on Amazon. Doesn't cost a fortune, written 20 years ago, but still sells because people enjoy it, and I'm very proud of it. It is a boy's own tale of daring do and all of that, and all the stories are in there at considerable length.
Yeah, I'll include a link to it at the bottom as well.
Thank you.
Whilst you were undercover, I mean, is there this constant that you were talking about people with 9mm tucked down their trousers, trying to edge you out whether you're a cop or not? Is there this constant fear of death then, or do you have a way of kind of keeping calm and collected?
No, there wasn't a constant fear of death, but there was a constant air of menace. Mm-hmm. Amongst all of the people that I dealt with, and all the negotiations that I dealt with, whether it be in a social housing estate with chronic social deprivation, mm-hmm. and I'm on the 5th or 6th floor in a flat which is double, treble, quadruple bolted, and there is simply no way of getting out of there in a hurry, and I'm with very dangerous people that are armed, or at the other end of the scale, I'm in a luxurious hotel, sitting at the bar, drinking whiskey at £25 a pop. There was always an air of menace. There was always a level of danger, but you just dealt with it. You just learned to deal with it and not have the fear cripple you so that the words don't tumble out of your mouth, because that's not a very good situation to be in. There were untold scary moments.
Did you ever have any, apologies, what were you going to say?
No, but I was fit and fearless. I look back on it sometimes and think, was that really me? But yeah, it was, because I feared no man, and I knew I had a propensity for lying. I knew I was pretty good at it. So it would have been a waste of my talents not to pursue that line of work as actively as I did.
Obviously, I mean, you're completely clear-minded now, and it was being professional at your job, and it very much was a job. But are there any kind of cases that maybe stick out in terms of have weighed on your mind since being undercover? I mean, I know that I remember in the podcast it's mentioned about James Bakery, and that stuck in my mind as something that sounded quite gruesome and something that was, so long-winded and grueling. I wasn't sure if there was any kind of case that maybe has weighed on your mind since your undercover days?
Well, the case that had the most impact upon me was Operation Zulu Cricket, which was when myself and an undercover operative from what was then Her Majesty's Customs and Excise, when me and this undercover operator from the Customs negotiated with a very, very serious firm to buy what was then the largest seizure of heroin ever made inside the UK. And this lot were clearly linked to terrorism, so much so that they were going to take payment in weaponry other than cash if we could supply all the arms that they wanted. And when that operation was successfully concluded by the drugs being delivered to me in a hotel at Gatwick Airport, the bad guys being arrested, so was I, for effect, slammed to the ground, handcuffed by armed police and all of that. So it was at that stage a very successful operation. When they were banged up, they realised that I must have been an undercover cop. So they worked on the theory that if they killed me, they killed the evidence. And to an extent, they were right. And then mysteriously, and for some reason which remains unbeknown to me, the team that were doing that case, because I was a hired hand, I went and worked for teams around the country, around Europe and further afield. The team that had led that investigation, one of the officers on that team had to compile a report for the Deputy Commissioner because there were multiple agencies involved in this case. The FBI, who discovered the plot to murder me, the DEA, the Drugs Enforcement Agency, the Irish Police, the Garda Síochána, Customs, police forces from around the world. It was a complicated case, and there was a lot of infighting between those organisations. So the Deputy Commissioner asked one of the officers on the investigating team to draw up a report, which he did, that ran to some 8 pages. But in that report, he didn't put my undercover number, which is allocated to you by the undercover unit at the yard. For some reason, he put my real and unusual name in there. There's only about 14 Bleksleys in the UK, and I've fathered most of them. Yeah. No, it's a joke, only 3. And then not only did my name repeatedly feature in that report, but it was then printed off, taken out of a police station in the back of an unmarked car. He went shopping on his way home from work, and guess what? Yeah, the car got broken into and that report got stolen. So once the existing plot to murder me was discovered, and then this report is now potentially out there in the hands of the criminals, it would have been very easy to find me and assassinate me. So I was very hurriedly taken away from my home, my life, my identity, and parachuted into witness protection. And then began the most miserable 2-year period of my life, which culminated in a catastrophic mental health breakdown, being admitted into a lock-in psychiatric ward, and it signalled the beginning of the end of my police career. So that case had an impact on me like no other, and it impacted on my life. It still impacts on my life today because my police career was 20 years instead of 30 years. And at the age of 40, I found myself on the scrap heap of life, no education to fall back on, no trade, no apprenticeship, no calling, nothing like that, and battling to regain my mental health. So it's fair to say that case had quite a dramatic effect upon my life.
Well, I want to touch on the witness protection thing, but you regarding the police car, well, obviously the things getting printed off, and then the police car going to the shops, and then the police car getting broken into. That's a lot of series of events that shouldn't have happened at all. Is there any part of you that kind of thinks that something smells a bit, and or was it just a bit of negligence, do you think?
Yeah, yes, of course. I spent 2 years in the witness protection program conspiracy theorizing as to how the friggin' hell did I find myself in this situation? Mm-hmm. What went wrong? What was crooked? What was conspiracy? I spent 2 years worrying about it. That was a major part of my catastrophic mental health breakdown, let alone the fact that I had to check under the car every morning to make sure some bastard hadn't put a bomb there, let alone the fact that I lived in continual fear of an assassin's bullet in the back of my head. Mm-hmm. Yeah, all those matters played heavily on my mind, and the where I played a part in my own downfall was that I drank too much and I smoked too much. which was hardly kind of surprising because I didn't live in a home. I lived in a hideout, and I'd sacrificed everything that was so important to me. So yeah.
I spoke to a while back. One of my earlier podcast guests were Stephen Murphy and Javier Pena, which I'm not sure if you're aware of, but they were the two people the two American DEA agents that hunted down Pablo Escobar. And Pablo Escobar had an 100 grand bounty on both of their heads, and they talked about how you kind of live in this constant paranoia and fear for your family and all this. How did this, warrant for an assassination on your head affect you, especially whilst you're in a place that you're kind of without an identity almost?
Well, that was it. The drinking, the smoking, and the conspiracy theorizing 24/7. And that manifested itself in my every thought pattern becoming severely affected, and to the point where I nearly killed a mate of mine in a pub one day. And then I realized what a danger I was becoming to other people. I realized for some time that I was, not well, but I was a professional liar. So I was very good at disguising it. But then at that stage, I realized I was becoming a danger to other people, not only myself. And that was the afternoon that I got hospitalized. So yeah.
Hand yourself into the hospital?
No, I after what had happened was I decided to hell with all this witness protection and all that stuff. And I went back home to my local boozer. And I was in there having a drink, of course, drinking too much. A mate of mine was sitting on a stool at the corner of the bar. Somebody pulled me aside, just told me some tittle tattle about him, which in normal circumstances I would have absolutely laughed in the face of it and just ignored it. But in my altered thinking, it became a big thing all of a sudden. I'd been drinking, and at one point I just put my pint down on the bar, walked over and clumped him, knocked him clean off the bar stool. As he was sprawled out on the floor, I then picked up the bar stool, raised it above my head, and I was going to bring it down and crush his head like a watermelon. And as I was pulling it down, fortunately, somebody shouted very loudly, very closely to my ear. They just shouted out, "Blex." And it was that split second where I had clarity of thought. It was a lucid moment. It was a lucid split second. And the bar stool was probably 18 inches away from crushing his head. And that split second lucid moment made me just toss the bar stool and stop, for which I remain eternally grateful, because I would have done him serious harm.
Okay.
And as I tossed the bar stool, I just, I held on to that lucid moment as I went and sat down and just said, this is just has to stop. Because I'm now so severely ill. I mean, the fact that I've lived in a very, very tough world doesn't mean that I was a tough person with a propensity for violence. On the contrary, the overwhelming majority of any fighting I've ever got involved in, I was gloved up and in a ring. That's where people should fight.
Yeah.
And I realized, because of my boxing capabilities, I'd seen how swiftly I knocked my pal off the bar stool and nearly killed him. I was a danger to others. So sat down, sort of head in hands. I said, I'm in severe need of help. Everybody in the pub was terrified of me at that stage, but they got hold of a really good mate of mine. And he came and picked me up and took me straight to hospital. And there I stayed for the next 3.5 weeks.
Do you feel, obviously, I mean, you talk about the lucid moment. That was a moment where someone had mentioned your real name in a period where you really, were living without one, or with a name that wasn't your own. Do you feel the kind of multiple identities that you had to live by every day had played a massive part on your mental health?
on any given day, I'd be 3 different people before about 11 o'clock. So I'm in the hideout, I'm in witness protection. I come downstairs and the post would be on the map. So that's the first reminder of the name that I'm living in this hideout, in my witness protection identity. I then have a shower, go out to the car, the van, whatever it was I was driving, check underneath it, do my anti-surveillance techniques, make sure I'm not being followed, then drive to work. And for that hour, when I drove to work, I could be myself, put the radio on, listen to whatever station I wanted to, and be me. Because then by the time I got to work, bizarrely.
So you were working throughout the witness protection period?
Sorry?
You were working throughout the witness protection period then?
Yeah. Of course, yeah. The police still wanted their pound of flesh out of me. And so I then get to work and one of the bosses would go, Blex, got another undercover job coming. You're the man for it. So I'd go off and do that. So by the time 11 o'clock in the morning came around, I've been 3 different people already in one day. So it's not surprising that all took its toll on me. And in fact, the wonderful psychiatrist who played such a major role in getting me well again said, if ever you are going to get well and stay well, you have to be Peter Bleksley again, just Peter Bleksley. All these multiple identities that you've adopted for years have really taken a severe toll, and you must revert back to being yourself.
Well, I mean, it's a fantastic redemption story in the fact that I'm sat here, you know, with a huge amount of respect for you and in awe of your stories, to the point where I've not even looked at the time for the first part. And to think that you were in such a dark point in your life and you were able to kind of clamber your way out of it. I think it's a testament to strength, surely.
It's more a testimony to the brilliance of the nurses and doctors of the NHS. To them goes the credit, and of course to the absolute genius of the scientists that invented the drugs that have helped me over the years. I mean, I still take a tiny maintenance dose of an antipsychotic medication 20 odd years after first becoming ill. And there's no stigma to that. I don't have a problem with that. I talk about it publicly, and here we are, because it's what keeps me well. I'm also, I think, a powerful voice whenever I get the opportunity for those suffering from mental health issues. We all have mental health. Sometimes it's robust, other times it's not so. And I've done as much as I can, I think, to take away the stigma about talking about mental health. We lose too many people far too young because they take their own lives. Too many lives are destroyed because people simply feel like they can't talk about mental health issues because there is a stigma. Some people feel. Well, it's all nonsense, and I'm glad to see that so many barriers are being knocked down and bridges being built now, so that people feel
quite rapidly. I feel that stigma is getting destroyed quite rapidly, considering if you were to talk about anyone about mental health during, I mean, not to sound, you know, blunt, but in your era of when you were policing, you know, mental health wasn't a thing really. People shook it off.
No, it wasn't. In fact, one commissioner of the police went down to my mum's house when I was in the grip of this serious, catastrophic mental health breakdown, and had the temerity to walk into my mum's house and say to her that I needed a kick up the arse. I mean, that's just how we were in the dark ages 20 odd years ago. Another police officer went into my local pub where the man who was best man at my wedding and is still my great mate used to work, and said to my mate, Blex is just putting it on, isn't he? He's trying to work his ticket. You know, such was the ignorance, the prejudice, the lack of knowledge amongst police officers back in those dark times. Yeah, I'm glad people talk about it now. I'm glad there are so many prominent people that get far more airtime and column inches than I do to talk about it.
Well, I mean,
but whenever I get the chance, you know, and I always say this to anybody having their struggles, we have them. There is no shame. But I would urge that, number one, you talk. Please just talk to someone. It really, really does help. And talking of help, get the help you need, the qualified medical help that you need. I'm not qualified in any way, shape or form. I'm not a medical person. I speak here purely from my own experiences. So talk, get the help, and if you get the right meds, take them. Don't think, I felt fine for 3 months, I don't need them anymore. Take them. Listen to the medical people. They're very clever. Unlike me, they paid attention at school, and it shows. So yeah, and feel no stigma. It happens to so many of us.
I think that's such a poignant point to end that section. I really want to talk about Kevin Parle, if you still have the time. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Do you need a break at all, or do you want to just plow on? It's completely up to you. Do
I need a break? No. Would I like a break? Yes, please.
I'd love to get a coffee as well. Do you want to take 5 then, and we'll come back?
Let's do that.
Hi there, it's Harry, the lesser interesting one of the podcast that you're watching right now. And I'm here to remind you, whilst me and Peter getting a coffee, that you should 100% watch or listen to the other episodes of the All Out Attack podcast. There's about 11 of us. Have a look. Right, back to part 2. We'll talk about Kevin Parle then.
Yeah.
Would you rather give the context to Kevin Parle, or?
Yeah, I mean, no one knows the story better.
Yeah, exactly. Who is Kevin Parle then? In the same way I ask you who's Peter Bleksley, who is Kevin Parle?
Kevin Parle is a Scouser, albeit he comes from the soft southern side of the city, should I say. He came from a very nice semi-detached suburban part of Liverpool. Yeah, he didn't come from the tough side of the streets at all. And he is wanted for 2 separate murders. He's not been convicted of them, but he's on the National Crime Agency's most wanted list. And they are 2 horrific, ghastly murders. The first was the shooting dead of a 16-year-old boy, Liam Kelly. I'll just hold up one of my flyers, if I may, and you can see Liam's picture there. Liam was a kid, a boy, 16, denied the opportunity to grow, to mature, to enter manhood, to find a life partner, to have a family, to provide for them. Okay, he wasn't a model student. Nobody's described him to me in that way, but he was denied all of those things because in the early hours of the 19th of June 2004, he was blasted with a shotgun and he died of the injuries. The second murder was the shooting dead of 22-year-old mother of 3 young children, Lucy Hargreaves, who also features on my flyers and posters. Lucy had 3 young kids, and she was also blasted to death with a shotgun, and then her body and her home were set alight. There's a lot more to tell about those 2 ghastly crimes, of course, and all the background to them, and how Kevin Parle came to be wanted for both of those crimes. But I started hunting Parle in April 2019. This was after I'd left a TV show that I used to be involved in called Hunted. I'd done 6 series of that, 4 series of the main show, 2 celebrity versions, and I'd basically come to the end of the road. We caught all the fugitives in the last series that I was in, and we were never going to top that. And the time was right for me to move on. I wanted to do another book. My publisher said, well, if you find the right subject material, go for it. And I decided that instead of writing about unsolved murders, which my previous 2 had been about, I thought I would combine my experience, my skill set, the network of people that I've built up over the years, my contacts, and what I'm best known for, gather all those together, tweak it a little bit, and instead of hunting pretend fugitives for television entertainment, hunt a real one. And they really do not come much more wanted than 6'5", broadly built Kevin Parle. It's dominated my life, my hunt for Parle, for the last 2 years and a bit. And it is something that I will simply never give up until one of two things happen. And that is, of course, obviously, Kevin Parle gets captured, or two, I gasp my last breath. It's as simple as that. They're the only two things that are going to stop me hunting Kevin Parle.
There is a school of thought, and it's something you mentioned quite heavily on the Manhunt podcast, and it's something that you quite openly disagree with. There's a school of thought that Kevin Parle is dead, is fish food, he was chopped up and thrown in the Mediterranean, or he was lobbed in the Mersey, and all this kind of stuff. What's your take on that school of thought?
Well, I'm pleased to say that after 2 years, we have put that urban myth to bed, by and large, because the word on the street from Liverpool is not what it used to be, which, as you quite rightly say, was he's dead, he's dead, he's dead. That ain't the talk on the street anymore now. The talk on the street is he's there, or he's there, or I've heard he was there. We've turned that round. It's taken me 2 years of continual slog to do that, but I'm glad that that's where we're at. You mentioned the podcast, and I would ask any of your followers to please have a listen to our BBC podcast, which is called Manhunt, Finding Kevin Parle. It's won an award. It's been downloaded over 3 million times and was the BBC's most popular true crime podcast of last year. It's a piece of work that we're all very proud of. And I'm very glad to say that the BBC have found some money to ensure that our podcast will return. And there are hundreds of thousands of people that want it to return, and it will. It's just that at the moment, I cannot put all the wealth of information that I've got into the public domain right now, because that will only benefit Parle and his cronies. Mm-hmm. So until really I can get on planes, trains and automobiles like I want to, we can't bring it back yet, but we will. My great friend and podcast editor, Mark Sandell, we're both desperate to get it back. We know there is such a huge public appetite for it to return, but we can't do that at the moment. Next week, I'm back in Liverpool. I've got 4 days up in Liverpool next week. Once again, raising awareness, spreading the word, liaising with the media, checking in with sources, doing all of that. And we will be back, and he will be found. Only this week, 3 days ago, somebody contacted me and said they've just had an encounter with a man they are utterly convinced is Kevin Parle. So my investigation is very much ongoing, but as you might see from behind me, I've renamed it The People's Hunt for Kevin Parle, because so many people, literally thousands of people, are helping me in the hunt for him. If anybody wants some of these flyers, they're A5 flyers, I'll put them in the post to you, or I'll send electronic versions. I've also got A4 posters, which are very similar. Mm-hmm. I'll happily put some of those in the post to you, and again, send you the electronic versions. This is a people's movement, the people's hunt. People are so desperate to find him because they are so appalled by the crimes that he is wanted for. And they, like me, want to see him in a court of law answering the allegations that are made against him. You know, that's the natural kind of symmetry of things. That's how life should be, because this hunt for him is really about truth over lies, right over wrong, and him answering the allegations.
Well, I think there's a stark detail that jumps out at me. I mean, growing up, in the area around Liverpool, the kind of don't grass mentality is so unbelievably prominent. And I mean, you'll, being as someone who's worked in law enforcement, you'll know about the don't grass mentality, and especially going around Liverpool and asking people to tell you about Kevin Parle. But there is one thing that jumps out, is the fact that these crimes were so ghastly and so abhorrent. I mean, you know, the setting fire of Lucy Hargreaves' house whilst her kids are in it, and all this, and her being an innocent woman, is kind of breaking that kind of wall of not wanting to cooperate with any sort of enforcement. Do you see it that way as well?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, I've been to Liverpool many times over the years. You know, watching QPR. My eldest son, who's 33, went to university at John Moores University in Liverpool. So I've been to that great city many times. But in the last 2 years, apart from during lockdown, I've also been to Liverpool more than I've ever been there before. I've spent weeks and weeks in my budget hotel down there. And you've nailed it. Yeah, that whole kind of codes that you grow up with. You don't talk to the establishment. Nobody grasses. I get it. I understand that. And I've experienced it elsewhere. But in Liverpool, it is particularly strong. But Lucy has been described to me by anybody that knew her as being as beautiful on the inside as she was on the outside. And consequently, her brutal and utterly unnecessary murder crossed the line. And I think that has been a very powerful player in making as many people come on board as they have to try and help and continue to help. And for that, of course, I am truly grateful. And next week, when I'm in Liverpool, I will be putting up my posters here, there, and everywhere. Let me just show you something, which I've only just got together this morning. Okay, bear with me. Right. Today, I went to my friendly local printers who do all this kind of stuff for me. And I collected 50 of these. Now, these are my posters, my A4 posters. But if you look carefully, you'll see they've been laminated, right? Or as the printer calls them, encased. And there's holes in the top and at the bottom. I hope you can see those there. And of course, I am going equipped with 50 of those, 100 of the paper versions of that, 500 flyers. But for these laminated posters, I have a huge selection of cable ties, because I am in the spirit of keeping the awareness going and irritating those who would harbour and fund Kevin Parle, because believe it or not, there are some people that don't want him caught. Those posters are going to be attached to lampposts, railings, gates, and all of that, far and across that wonderful city. And yes, I know some people will come out and take them down. They'll need a pair of pliers. And, you know, I know that will happen. But, of course, every person that does that, it's, again, getting in their head that I've not gone away. I'm not going away. I'm not giving up. And the hunt is very, very much on. Yes, I can't get on planes and fly to places that I want to. But one day that will happen. And, of course, one day he will be in handcuffs. And that will, and so will start the process that hopefully will end up with him in a court of law, having to answer those allegations. So, yeah, I've got all my kit ready today. You know, I've been out, bought the cable ties, been to the printers, all that kind of stuff. And I'm very, very excited about getting back into that brilliant city, which I absolutely adore. You know, and I love the people. I truly do. I find that Scousers, you know, to know them is to love them, generally speaking. If you make a friend of a Scouser, you've got a friend for life. And they are some terrific people. Of course, I've had unpleasantness and I've been trolled and people have wasted my time, tried to drain me of my money, my emotions, my time and all of that. I get that. But, you know, if you're going to be a gobby South Londoner putting yourself up front as publicly as I do, making a BBC podcast about it, you know, getting in the media frequently, and if I might say, writing a book about my hunt for Kevin Parle. This is Manhunt, my latest book, published towards the end of last year. Still very relevant. Very, very different from our podcast. This is a very different vehicle from the podcast. Same topic, but this is very much my personal journey through the hunt. Whereas if anybody listens to the BBC podcast, you'll find that it has a lot of other stuff, and of course pays great respects to Liam and Lucy, as does of course the book. But the book's a very different thing, and I'm pleased to say that many thousands of people have enjoyed both because they are so clearly distinctly different. That, by the way, my Manhunt book is only £4 on Amazon today when I checked earlier, so almost for the price of a magazine, or less than the price of a pint, as you'll pay down here. You can get a book, and people have said some very, very nice things about it.
Well, I mean, I would implore people to buy the book. Obviously you've released the book, you've done the podcast. I think as well as you doing the actual investigative work and you know, coming agonizingly close to finding Paul and getting all this information for him, I think one of the main effects of all of your work is the huge amount of publicity you've put on Paul's name, and the fact that, you know, before hearing of your case for Paul, I'd never heard of Kevin Parle, and I'm from, you know, round about the area. And I would argue that nearly all people that I know, you know, from the Liverpool area hadn't heard of Paul. How, obviously you called it the People's Hunt now. At the start of your hunt, he could have been anywhere in the world. How much would you argue that his world has shrunk since you've started the investigation?
I sincerely hope it does, and I'm sure it has. You make me kind of chuckle saying that you've never heard of him. That just encapsulates everything that we've done in the last couple of years. On the 29th of April 2019, when I launched my hunt, I did that at a press conference in London. I wanted the press conference to be in Liverpool out of respect to Liam, Lucy, that great city and its people. But sadly, some of the big hitting journalists wouldn't make the journey up there, and would only come if it was held in Liverpool, in London. I was really irritated by that, but hence we had to do it. But the minute that was over and I'd done a radio interview, me and Mark Sandell were on the train to Liverpool, and we dumped our bags in the hotel, said to the receptionist, you know, where's the nearest pub? And so by now it's kind of like 9:30 on a very long day, but we're in the pub, lovely boozer. And I said to the governor, do you mind if I hand out some flyers? And he said, no, what's it all about? You know, what are you doing? And I kid you not, people in the pub, when we were handing out the flyers, universally went, Kevin who? Never heard of him. 2 years down the line, with over 3 million downloads, thousands of copies of that book, and all the other associated publicity, Kevin Parle's name is far, far better known than it was 2 years ago. So that's a little win for me. Every person that hears about Kevin Parle that wasn't previously aware of him is a little victory for me, and goes some way towards shrinking the world for him, which is exactly what I'm trying to do. I want to squeeze the planet so tightly that at some point his 6'5" nut pops up and law enforcement go bang and slap the handcuffs on. You know, that's the hope. That's why I'm doing it. Why am I doing it? Of course, I'm doing it for Liam and Lucy, because this is not about me. And in a strange kind of way, it's not really about Kevin Parle. It's about Liam and Lucy, and trying to get him in front of a court of law.
Because they've had 16 and 15 years respectively, or the families have, with no answers, no justice. You know.
Well, other people were convicted in connection with Liam's murder. That's quite a long story, which you're all very welcome to read about in the book. But the man who pulled the trigger, a court was told, was Kevin Parle. And he has not been in court yet.
Well, and no one was convicted on. I mean, people were actually acquitted in regards to Lucy's murder.
Yes, two men stood trial for Lucy's murder, Tony Downs and Kirk Bradley. Tony Downs and I have exchanged letters. He's in prison for other offences. The letter, I've repeated the letter in the book. It's yes, interesting conversation that he and I had via letter. It's a long and it's a quite complex story, which I tell, I hope, in a very straightforward manner. But no justice. No one ever convicted in connection with Lucy's murder. And that is an absolute outrage, because as police officers have said from Merseyside Police throughout the years, her murder is one of, if not the most gruesome and ghastly murder ever in the history of Merseyside Police.
Well, and it was the first crime that Merseyside Police had ever put a reward for any information on as well. That's how much it really rocked the city. Bearing in mind as well, I was 4 when Lucy Hargreaves was murdered. Not trying to, make you feel bad in terms of age-wise.
The sooner we move on from age, the better this podcast will become, because you might find the guest leaving fairly promptly.
I mean, you talked about your boxing skills. I don't fancy getting on the wrong side of you, Pete. But I mean, obviously, you were talking about the world getting smaller for Kevin Parle, and there was almost an air of excitement in your voice in the fact that in 2 years you've made such strides. On the flip side, how do you think Kevin's feeling about that?
I hope that I've given him some sleepless nights. I hope that I've caused him a lot of inconvenience. And if I have, they are, of course, only small, very, very small victories. My aim remains the same as it was on the 29th of April 2019, and that is to see him in handcuffs and then appear in a court. And that will happen. It will happen at some stage. Unfortunately, I think COVID has benefited him hugely, because I'm pretty sure that had we not gone into lockdown on the 23rd of March 2020, he'd have been captured around about that time. Which is unfortunate. But I'm not going to be deterred. I'm a very sort of determined kind of bloke. I've got the energy and enthusiasm for work that I had when I was half my age. And I lived my life by the C word, steady, commitment, right? Commitment. That's what it's all about. If you're going to do something, anything in your life, commit to it, or don't bother.
Yeah.
Please, whatever that may be it a hobby, your work, a relationship, either commit or just don't get involved, because then you're wasting your time and everybody else's time. And I'm very, very committed to this hunt for Kevin Parle. And I can't wait to be back in the great city of Liverpool next week.
Well, I mean, the determination that you've had over the 2 years, I mean, is probably the standout kind of factor in the way that you've really buried yourself into this case. And especially over lockdown, you talked about how, you were writing the book essentially when everyone else was twiddling their thumbs and thinking of things to do. You were very committed to the case, and things flew past you. How has that maybe affected your life in terms of how much you've focused entirely on this case and maybe not focused on other things?
Yeah, it's Liam and Lucy. It comes back to that again. And I make no apology for that. It's all about Liam and Lucy. And there have been times when I have given time up to some other projects, not major projects, but a half a day's work might come in here, or a half a day's work might come in there. And of course, that's all very helpful in terms of perhaps getting a small check or something to put in the bank. But this dominates my life.
Yeah.
Last month, I took part in a charity fundraiser, which I called 1,000,000 steps in May. And I set myself that task to walk 1,000,000 steps in the 31 days of May. That equates to 32,259 steps every day. Now, if anybody counts their steps, they will know just what a stretch that is. And as I've already said, I'm 61, and it's fair to say I don't have the lifestyle habits of an Olympic athlete. So that was a real challenge. And I did it for a charity called Support After Murder and Manslaughter, because through hunting Kevin Parle and through my other books, I have spent a lot of time with people that have lost a loved one to murder. And I know of the catastrophic effects that can have on people's lives. It causes a tsunami of repercussions that spread very, very far and wide, crimes such as Liam and Lucy's murders do. So that month was largely dedicated to putting one foot in front of the other, doing 15.5 miles walking every single day. And it really was a stretch and a challenge physically. But I did it and raised over £12,000 for, they're called SAM, SAMM, Support After Murder and Manslaughter. Everything I do is about victims, because they get such a raw deal so often. Not only do they lose a loved one, and I think we can all kind of try and imagine how catastrophic that must be, whether it's a partner, a child, a friend, a work colleague, to lose a loved one to murder is horrific. And then, of course, there is the trauma, the bereavement. In some cases, they get a pretty raw deal at the hands of the criminal justice system. Dealing with the police can be very difficult. The Crown Prosecution Service, if somebody gets arrested and charged, the court system, all these things can be very difficult. If nobody is arrested and convicted, that longing for justice can be something very difficult to deal with. And I could go on and on and on. But SAM, Support After Murder and Manslaughter, do brilliant, brilliant work. And by walking 1,000,000 steps in May, I raised over £12,000 for them,
which is
and
fantastic.
I'm really delighted with that, and so are the charity. Just as an aside, if anybody's enjoyed this podcast and they think it's worth £1, then please go to givepenny.com, search 1,000,000 steps in May, and you can donate £1 or £2. And I guarantee you, all of that money will go to helping people in their very darkest hours.
I'll include that all in the bottom as well.
Thank you. SAM can't make public a lot of what they do because it is confidential, for no other reason other than bereaved people often want the help that they get to remain confidential. And I think we can all understand that.
Yeah.
So it can be a stretch for them to raise money. So yeah, if this was worth £1, then please go over to givepenny.com.
I hope
that would be wonderful.
In any way it can, because I mean, it often the cliche is often that the victim, the family of the victim of a murder or something like that, is often the one who's perhaps serving the life sentence, really, because there's no redemption. It's so hard to climb over that hill and forgive someone, or it really weighs on you. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic cause. What I'll try and wrap up, because I know we've been talking for so long. I've been lost in the stories and your takes on things, Peter. What I do want to ask, obviously, to come back to Kevin Parle, because I do want to end on Kevin Parle and keep his name and his face very much, there you go, very much resonating in the minds of people who are maybe listening to this who haven't heard of Kevin Parle. And just to really paint the picture of the man he is. I mean, this man, is a alleged serial murderer, in the fact that he has allegedly been a part of 2 murders of 2, very innocent people. And in the podcast, there's talks about how he's treated ex-girlfriends and his mindset. And I know you have your crack team of experts who help you. Would you class Kevin Parle as a psychopath, I know it's a word that gets overused, but in terms of his mentality and movements and the things that he's done and then jetted off to Spain to essentially have a holiday almost immediately after the murders, would you class him as a psychopath or with psychopathic tendencies?
Well, I'm no psychologist or criminologist, so I will leave that up to the experts that contribute both to the book and our podcast. Their words can be heard and read quite clearly there. What I will say is that based on a lot of witness testimony from people that knew him, I think it is fair to say he's a smart guy. He's very intelligent. Clearly, he's evaded law enforcement for over 16 years, so he's no fool. But if the testimony that I have been told is true, and I have no reason to doubt the veracity of it, then he is a thoroughly unpleasant person. But those who will make judgments on Kevin Parle and his actions, should I say, will hopefully be a jury that will make their decision based on the evidence that they hear.
Yes.
And that, of course, will be a matter for the police and the Crown Prosecution Service. My hunt for Kevin Parle is certainly not a personal thing, because, of course, I've never met him. It's merely a professional challenge that I've set myself, because I firmly believe that the natural order of things is that people accused of crime need to answer the allegations made against them.
And bring about justice for the people who have been affected by him. Just to finish off then, Peter, and then I'll let you go. But I mean, I think the thing that was prominent on your early leaflets was, Kevin Parle, I'm coming for you. That this man is well connected. He's probably funded by criminal means and to keep going. And he probably has people who are looking across all media to figure out what you're saying about him. So if that's the case, and one of Kevin Parle's cronies might be watching this, and you had a message to him, or you could stand on a soapbox and put out a message to him, what would you say to Kevin Parle right now?
Okay, they'll probably laugh at this, because those who are harbouring him and funding him, shall we say, are involved in the most serious of criminality, which is extremely lucrative. However, what I will say is that his capture is inevitable. He will be caught. And whilst I've had my issues with Merseyside police over the last couple of years, one thing that they've done recently is that they've changed their position with regards to the £20,000 reward that is on offer for his capture. That 20 grand used to be based on two conditions: that he was captured and that he was convicted. Now, I've argued long and hard with Merseyside police that those conditions were unfair. And I lay out my reasons for that in the book quite clearly. Fortunately, Merseyside police have reconsidered their position, and that £20,000 is now on offer for the information that leads only, I say only, that leads to his arrest. The conviction element of it has been ditched. So, one phone call, either to Crime Stoppers, okay, if you want to remain anonymous, that's easy. That's just pick up the phone and ring Crime Stoppers. 0800 555 111. You don't have to give your name, where you're from, anything like that. One phone call, 20 grand in your bin, tax free. I know 20 grand to many villains is like small cash, small fry, small change rather. I'll get there in the end. But, however, if you don't make that phone call, he's going to get captured and you won't get that 20 grand. So surely you might as well cash in now while you can. The whole being subject to his conviction has been ditched, and fair play to Merseyside police for that. Very, very good. It's just for the information that leads to his capture. and it's going to happen. So why not cash in for 20 grand while you can? I can hear some of them laughing at me now as they listen, you know. But, and then of course, if you're involved in harbouring him or funding him, you might well find yourselves staring down the barrel of a lengthy jail term for exactly those kind of crimes, harbouring an offender, money laundering, who knows? I suspect those who are captured with him will be subject to some form of investigation.
Oh God, yeah. Well,
by me, if not anybody else.
These it is only a matter of time, really, and you can see that in both Manhunt, Hunting Britain's Most Wanted Murderer, and Manhunt, the book, and then Manhunt Finding Kevin Parle on BBC Sounds, that show the investigation. But I mean, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I really do appreciate it, and for you to not only talking about Kevin Parle, but also sharing your stories with me. Yeah, I'm massively grateful.
Thank you, Harry. It's been my great pleasure. Thank you to everybody for listening or watching. And I don't know if you have guests on for a part 2, but at my age, I've got loads of stories to tell.
Oh God, I'd love that. I think a lot of people would as well. I'd love a Peter Bleksley part 2.